Welcome to my first tutorial video where I will show you how to paint a misty forest, as seen in the background of my portrait of Catherine Doherty. This is a great one to try if you're new to oils, or to painting in general, because it is a very simple color palette, really just different shades of the same blue. This painting will help you learn the basics of mixing color and blending, and otherwise becoming more familiar with this medium. For reference, I'll be loosely following this photo of a misty forest. In this tutorial, I'll be using the water mixable oils from Winsor & Newton, although in theory you could just as easily do this in regular oils or even acrylic. Let's quickly go over our materials and get started. I will be using just 4 paints in this palette: French ultramarine, yellow ochre, titanium white, and ivory black. You will also need just a bit of painting medium, which helps with gloss and blending, as well as a cup of water and a cloth for cleaning your brushes. The brushes that you use will depend entirely on the size of your painting and the amount of detail you want to get into. For this tutorial, I am using a 1/2 inch shader for applying the background, a small filbert for painting the first layer of trees, and a small pointer for the second layer and finer details. I like to mix my colors on a glass surface so that the paints don't soak in. I'm currently using a cheap picture frame. We will start by mixing the color of the sky, which is mostly white with just a bit of French ultramarine and a hint of yellow ochre. The yellow softens the starkness of the blue and gives it a faint green tinge. I have a rule that I should never use a color straight out of the tube, not even white. I always mix in a bit of another color, as it adds complexity and realism to a painting. Beneath that, I am mixing slightly darker combinations of those same paints, but using less white and more of the blue, and again, just a hint of yellow. And lastly, I'm mixing the darkest blue, which has no white at all in it. It's basically navy. I'm also going to add a bit of black to further deepen this shade. I am painting on an 11x14 gessoed wood board, but you can just as easily paint on canvas or primed artboard the size of your choice. I'm going to start painting at the top of my board with that lightest blue, and I'm going to go about 1/3 of the way down the board. You can see that pretty much right away I realized that I didn't have enough paint to go the distance that I needed to, so I just mixed some more. You will have to mix as you go, and until you are familiar with color theory, don't be surprised if you don't always get an exact match. You can start adding the next darkest blue. Try applying just a bit underneath and then blending it upwards into the paint above it. If you ever apply paint to your board and realize that you didn't quite get it right, don't sweat it. If it needs more blue, add more blue. If it's not light enough, add more white. You can easily adjust your palette and blend it into the current paint, as oils stay wet for a long time. The randomness of the misty trees is very forgiving for this kind of experimentation. Work your way downwards into the darkest blue and finish covering your board. Don't worry about the appearance of your brush strokes right now. This is just laying a foundation which will eventually be covered up by trees. You can quickly go over everything again with a large brush to blend it a little better. Pick a point just above where the background starts to become dark and start painting your first tree, beginning at the peak and working your way downwards. I am using the small filbert. It might help to paint a thin line where your tree is going to go and painting small angled brushstrokes away from that to form the branches. Start with dark blue at the tops of the trees and gradually use lighter paint as you blend your trees into the background underneath. You may also want to brighten the mist a bit. This first layer is just to sketch out the placement of our trees, so don't worry about going into too much detail or trying to make them too dark. If you look at our reference image, you'll see that the tips of the trees are the darkest, then fade down into the mist. Some trees are dark and clear, while others are barely visible through the fog. I wanted my darkest trees to be at the edges and at the bottom, where the background fades to navy, while the trees in the middle are only a shade lighter than the misty background. This frames the composition nicely. As we continue painting our trees, I'm going to stress that I am not following my reference closely at all. I'm pretty much just putting trees where I think they'll look good and enjoying the process. Don't be afraid to get creative and make mistakes. The beautiful thing about painting in oil is that it is very easy to go back and try again. Remember that when it comes to painting a forest, you want it to be imperfect. Some trees are larger than others, some have funky branches, others are thin and scraggly. With the mist adding to the confusion, you can play around with the placement and contrast of your trees. There is lots of room for mistakes. Have fun with it. Plus, messy brushstrokes will trick the eye into seeing foliage and detail where there is none. Now it's time to paint a second layer with more detail. I am using the small pointer now and refining and extending the rough trees I've already created. It's hard for me to explain how to paint the branches. The easiest thing to do is to check your reference and try to copy the shapes of the real trees. Again, the perfection is in the imperfection. Avoid making these look like the Christmas trees you drew as a kid. Real trees are not symmetrical. Some branches are long, others short, some with extra knobs or funny angles. Remember that some trees are hardly visible at all, so pick some paint that is just a hint darker than the background when painting those ones. There were a few days between shots here, so my paint underneath was already quite dry, making it easier for me to apply a nice dark layer on top. If you want to keep painting while it's still wet, go right ahead. Painting wet on wet makes for a wonderful buttery finish, although you might have to be more persistent in order to get the same level of contrast. I'm also adding a few faint treetops in the mist to make the image look a bit more complex and interesting. You'll notice that sometimes I go back over my darkest trees with a bit of light paint and add a few spots. This just breaks up the branches since most trees aren't actually that dense. It gives the illusion of light peeking through. Finally, I'm going to go back over the solid areas with that large brush just to smooth it out and blend the lower trees into the background. Unnecessary detail will draw unwanted attention. I'm also adding some very faint treetops in the sky to give the illusion of the forest disappearing into the distance. Feel free to lighten the mist or add a few more trees where you feel you need to. And that concludes this tutorial video. If you have any questions, please leave a comment. I'd love to chat.